niche things that I do in particular within that. In the past and currently, I have done support groups for adult male survivors of IPV, and so intimate partner violence and childhood sexual abuse. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. Let's do that. Is that working? All right. And out of that, so I've run several of those groups, and out of that, I've been able to start an ongoing support group for adult male survivors, which has been running now for a little bit over a year, which is really exciting. And then just before COVID hit, so we had been running trauma support groups in our local jails for female inmates, and I had done that for a couple of years. And we wanted to expand into the male population. And so what we did was start with just a presentation about trauma in general. And I presented to about 40 to 50 male inmates, and just to kind of gauge interest in a group like this. And we got about 10 or so people to sign up, which was really exciting. And we had one really wonderful session, and I haven't been back since because that was March of last year. So really excited to hopefully get back in there soon and be doing that work again. So what are we going to be talking about today? So the first thing we're going to do is something called a gender role analysis. So I'll talk more about that here in just a second. And then from that, talk more about gender socialization and how for men, for boys and men in our society, some of those things, so y'all were talking a lot about boys will be boys. Some of the things we normalize in our society, or, oh, we say it's tradition, may in fact be traumatizing. So we'll spend some time talking about that. And then, of course, getting into and dissecting this buzzword, toxic masculinity. So talking a little bit about it in general, and then getting a little bit more specific and talking about its effects on relationships, as well as its effects on sexuality and sexual abuse. And then I don't know if it was Liza, but said, okay, now we're going to see the flip side, right? We hear a lot about toxic masculinity, but less so about healthy masculinity, but that's a thing too. So what is it and how can we promote it? And hopefully there will be some time for questions. Disclaimer, this is a very nuanced subject. It's complicated. There are hardly ever any black and white things here. So I'm going to give you what I got. Feel free to ask questions, but I can't necessarily tell you exactly what to do, right? And then finally, remember self-care. We're going to be talking about, possibly some triggering things such as suicide, sexual assault, domestic violence. So if these things are in fact triggering for you, or anything throughout this presentation, please do what you have to do to take care of yourself. Step away, grab some water, and know that this is being recorded. So if you need to come back and check it out at a later time, definitely do that. Okay. All right. So gender role analysis. I actually do this with all of my men's groups during one session. So I want to take some time to think about, in our culture, in our society in general, stereotypically, what does it mean to be a man? And so truly ask you all, what is manly? So starting off first, what are the messages we receive about what is manly?
Men are typically breadwinners.
What did you say, winners or breadwinners?
Breadwinners, like they're considered that's supposed to, be the head of the household.
Mm-hmm.
Go to them for being strong. Someone said in the chat.
Strong, yeah. I'm having a hard time seeing the chat, so if you could shout out either what people are saying, or if people want to shout it out, that'd be great.
Someone said always having the answer. Another person said they have high sex drives,
Oh yeah.
physical/mental strength. Oh, these are good. Men
Hmm.
are expected to be more logical and less emotional.
Ooh, yeah.
That's okay. Dominance, financial success.
They can't cry.
Mm,
Now because I have two loose teeth.
okay.
Competitive.
Competitive. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. Okay. On the flip side, what is considered to not be manly?
Skincare.
Did you say skincare?
Yeah, like I hear a lot about how men aren't expected to like really take good showers or like exfoliate or just do basic skincare.
I was just thinking about this last night, how in the late 90s, early 2000s, we created an entire word to describe a man who cared about his appearance, metrosexual. Like we had to put it in a separate box, right? Because we couldn't reconcile that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, taking care of oneself in that way. Or a lot of times when we have the conversation about self-care, we're not really thinking about it in terms of men. We're like, oh, go get your nails done. You know, more things that we typically associate with women for sure.
I think
And
in
then
general, oh, sorry. I think in general, men are like more reluctant to break gender roles. Like I feel like they are typically like restricted in their self-image and how they express themselves, like with clothing or their hairstyle and stuff like that.
Yep. So I'm just going to put repressed for that.
Someone said wearing pink. We got being submissive.
vulnerability.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Intimate friendships. Lots of
Yeah.
caring about.
Emotion.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that about emotions?
Showing emotion.
Mhm.
Caring about others. Empathetic.
I'm going to say weakness.
Yeah, somebody put sensitivity, being short,
Oh, yeah.
having deep conversations.
I'm going to loop that into intimate friendships, deep conversations. Yeah. Wow, these are all wonderful examples.
Somebody said also taking care of children or others, housework.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, caretaking, certain household chores. Yep. And so looking at this, wow, we have a lot to say, or we've heard a lot about what it means to be a man and what is not manly. And both boys and men receive these messages, but we all do in our society. We all get these messages about what's okay and what's not okay. And we can even take it further and talk about, okay, certain hairstyles are manly and not manly. Certain drinks, right? Whiskey is a man's drink, but ooh, Mike's Hard Lemonade, that's for girls. Shoot, we even gender food. We have food in the freezer aisle called Hungry Man. And who do you think lean cuisine is advertised towards? So yeah, we're seeing lots and lots of messages about what it means to be a certain gender, and in this case, what it means to be a man. Okay, so how do we know this? Like, how do we figure these things out? Through what we call gender socialization, and we receive these messages through a variety of ways. First of which are primary caregivers. So for most, they're parents. This is how we receive most of our information as we're growing up, right? And the old adage, do as I say, not as I do, doesn't work so well. We tend to absorb things, we tend to see and imitate, and we learn from our primary caregivers, you know, perhaps from our father figure, what it means to be a man based on how they act, how they handle their emotions, how they are in relationships. So we're receiving a bulk of information from our primary caregivers. And then, of course, peers. We receive plenty of information and messages from our peers, and that information tends to hold more weight as, you know, we get older, right? That peer relationships and opinions become more important as we age, especially into adolescence. You know, there's almost like this bell curve, right? Where, oof, you know, in our teenage years, that's where it's most important. And then, of course, teachers, coaches, religious leaders. These all have an impact on, you know, how we see the world, how we view ourselves. And then finally, media of all forms. So movies, TV shows, music. This is probably less of a thing these days, but, you know, music videos used to send lots of messages about what is cool, what's not, what it means to be a man. Of course, social media, you know, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. And then, of course, you know, I mentioned earlier advertising in terms of hungry man versus lean cuisine. You know, what is geared primarily towards women? There's lots of talk about, you know, this pink tax that, you know, if we make a pink razor, that's for women and it's also going to cost more. So we're inundated with all of this pretty much from the jump. Okay, right? Good Lord, gender reveals, right? Before we are even out of the womb, we, you know, we're receiving messages about who we are and what it means to be in this world. And so, as I mentioned, some of this socialization can in fact be traumatizing. So some people like to talk about big T versus little t traumas. I tend to like to stay away from that because what's traumatizing for one person may not be for the next. And, you know, we should really stay away from comparing traumas. But when we say big T, we're probably talking more about like war, rape, domestic violence, really any experiences of violence. And then little t traumas are more along the lines of perhaps traumas that still have an impact, but maybe aren't as easily recognizable, you know, or maybe are more chronic, you know, not this explosive event. So this idea of boys will be boys, right? Some of these things we just brush off as, oh, well, this is how we do things. You know, this is tradition. They're just horsing around. That's just locker room talk, right? When in fact, you know, it may be traumatizing, but either we as society don't view it as that, and because of that, maybe the person who it's impacting doesn't recognize it as a trauma either. So some examples: bullying, right? Something we didn't, or I forgot to mention during the gender role analysis is what's manly versus not manly. So someone said, you know, high sex drive, but we also say, you know, being gay is not manly. There are certain words we associate with being not manly, like, you know, sissy, pussy, the F word, what have you. And so, yeah, bullying goes on during childhood through adolescence. And we might say, oh yeah, kids get bullied, it is what it is. That can be incredibly impactful, and definitely send someone messages about their gender identity, what it means to be a boy or a man. Hazing is another example and can certainly start as young as in middle school, right? With sports teams, with band, with different clubs. And as we go through middle school and high school and then to college, of course, many people are familiar with hazing as it relates to like Greek life. And it's on a spectrum, you know, same with bullying. There's some maybe less harmful things that go on. And then some pretty harmful stuff, even to the point of death. Any other examples that you all can think of as far as socialization that might be actually quite traumatizing, especially as it relates to, the way boys and men grow up in our society?
I feel like blatant homophobia is a perfect example because I'm from New York and you can't say anything that's like just a tad sexual without like a group of boys going like, hey, yo, that's gay. And it sucks because like, first of all, homophobia in the sense of it, and again, being from New York, I've heard people like proudly call themselves phobe, like lingo for homophobia. And they don't realize that homophobia isn't, I mean, either, no matter how you slice it, it doesn't make any sense, but homophobia isn't being scared of gay people. Homophobia is the fear that you yourself might be gay. And that's something you have to dissect within yourself, but instead it becomes a projection that just solicits so much violence and hatred when it's really all just coming from inside.
Yeah, and that's a great example because it creates this othering effect, right? And you're either in or you're out, and you don't want to be out. And so, that then may force you to then engage in that same bullying, right? And that might be traumatizing, forcing yourself to bully someone else to make sure that you're okay. That can do a lot of damage.
I think also like in households like with like not necessarily domestic violence, but when in some households where they use physical violence as means of like punishment, I feel like men or boys get a much rougher treatment because they are conditioned to be stronger than women. So they'll have it a lot worse, and that can manifest in so many different ways that can be really traumatic and detrimental to their futures.
Yeah, that's another great example. And absolutely, that difference between the way we discipline boys, perhaps, versus the way we discipline girls, and just, to what degree we just accept that as what it is. Like, oh, yeah, of course I got it worse. That's not a big deal, but okay, what impact did it really have?
I would also say probably like growing up in a sports team, mainly like football or wrestling, just to like give a few, or baseball, where you have that whole jock mentality, like I can get the girl, I run the school, you have to listen to me, everyone's beneath me, they can pick on whoever they want. And because of that, they think that they're like set for life and nothing applies to them, and that gives them the right to treat people badly and to basically uh, think that women are their property, and it has a very bad toxic vibe and environment for them to grow up in.
Definitely. And something else too is, okay, something else that might be traumatizing is, an abusive coach, just in terms of, oh, we're going to be tough, we're going to be hardcore, yelling and screaming at the athletes. Oh yeah, they're just a really good coach. They're just really tough and we're better for it. Maybe not so much. Or, kind of over the top sports parents, right? That are, you better win or else. That can happen as well. Okay, thank you all for those contributions. So let's get into it. Toxic masculinity. What is it? It gets thrown around a lot. Toxic masculinity describes the ways in which traditional masculinity or masculine socialization can be harmful to both men and others. So yeah, this presentation is for everybody because it affects us all. So how is it harmful? Some examples. Men and suicide. In 2019, men died by suicide 3.63 times more often than women. And in fact, the highest rate of suicide is in middle-aged white men. So y'all brought up that men are often thought to, be head of household, be the breadwinner. They're also, supposed to be the protector. And part of thing that factors into this statistic is, okay, yeah, we really got to look out for the men that are retiring who have tied their entire identity into what they can produce, what they can provide. And when that is taken away from them, they're lost. Depression sets in. So that's a big reason why, we're looking at middle-aged men as being the highest at risk. Going along with that is with what we see with men and help-seeking behaviors. They are less likely to seek help for both physical and mental health issues. So there's already stigma around mental health and getting help for that for everybody. But even more so with men, right? We said, oh, it's unmanly to be weak. So, asking for help might be seen as being weak. It is a well-known stereotype, that men don't ask for help with, nope, I'm not going to go to the doctor. I'm not going to ask for directions, right? And that's like a common joke that men don't ask for directions, that they don't ask for help, that they have to be independent and strong and know all the answers, right? So that leads a lot of issues. In fact, just so aside from suicide, shorter life expectancy than females by 5 years. Probably not everything can be attributed to toxic masculinity, but I think there definitely is a link there. That men are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, such as, they're more likely to engage in substance abuse. If you've ever watched now an old TV show, Jackass, right? You can kind of easily see that correlation with risk behaviors and shorter life expectancy, right? Perhaps more prone to that peer pressure, to be manly, to be cool, to be daring. Also, we tend to, associate low self-esteem, body image issues, eating disorders more with women. And while that, that does occur more with women, the National Eating Disorder Association, they found that 1 in 3 people with an eating disorder are male, but are less likely to see help. And so chances are that number is actually higher, or we're just not identifying it, or they're not identifying their behaviors as unhealthy, right? So and eating disorders are a spectrum. So whether that's on the end of, bulimia and anorexia, or we're looking at unhealthy exercise behaviors, unhealthy use of supplements to bulk up. We all, if we're creating this image of what it means to be, a perfect man, a man's man, Arnold Schwarzenegger, because wasn't it him that said, oh, don't be a girly man? How damaging is it if you don't fit that image, and what might that drive you to do? And finally, it's limiting. These traditional gender roles put people into a box. Even, we gender jobs. Men are supposed to be leaders. It's less likely. So if, we have this idea of what a man should be, and parents and teachers or whoever are guiding them in a certain way, like, hey, I want to play piano and I want to cook. No, you're going to play football, and go to college for, and you're going to do some welding. I don't know. But then again, bringing it all the way back around, you get to the end of your career and you're like, wow, I've been doing this job. I've been living this life that I never really wanted in the first place. And I missed out on X, Y, and Z passions. So toxic masculinity can cause someone to deny themselves and, to wear this mask, and that can be incredibly damaging. So if we look more specifically at toxic masculinity and its effects on relationships, the first thing that comes to mind, I think, for most people would be domestic violence, right? Huge correlation between toxic masculinity and domestic violence. Males are the predominant perpetrators, if we're talking about heterosexual relationships. And actually, in fact, adherence to traditional gender roles is a risk factor for domestic violence. It's not saying that you can't abide by traditional gender roles, but using traditional gender roles to justify abuse, to say, no, you have to stay home because you're a woman, instead of having a conversation about it, that is a risk factor for violence in the relationship. On the flip side, you know, women can be perpetrators, you know, and it does happen outside of heterosexual relationships. And because of the way society views this, because of toxic masculinity, men are therefore then less likely to be believed and supported as victims. Think about even the images that you see from sexual and domestic violence agencies in general, right? It's usually pictures of women. So men might not see themselves as victims, but also within our systems, they may be less likely to be granted a protective order if they're seeking one, right? Because, hey, you're a man, she's not going to hurt you, don't worry about it, right? Or even be believed that there's abuse going on at all. So sets them up to be more likely to be a perpetrator, and then also hurts them as victims. Household disparities, so we mentioned this during the gender role analysis. If you're familiar with the mental load, so the idea that, again, primarily in heterosexual relationships, that, okay, let's say dad is the breadwinner, you know, but maybe mom is working too, but she's also the one that has all the doctor's appointments, all the soccer games, who's allergic to what, and meal planning all in her head, right? So that puts strain on mom, strain on the relationship. What if she's sick? What if she has to go somewhere, you know? And then dad has no idea how to run the household. So can negatively impact the family as a whole. Custody issues, should, you know, the relationship, should the family, you know, separate? Stereotypically, you know, and in most states, there is going to be a bias towards mom. You know, that mom is much more likely to win custody than dad is. We have issues with maternity leave in general in this country, you know, not getting enough maternity leave, never mind paternity leave. You know, and that goes for both heterosexual and homosexual relationships, right? We just don't think in terms of, oh yeah, we don't value dad necessarily as much as we value mom. And so that hurts dad, you know, in his relationship with the child and their relationship with dad. And then also it's not supporting mom either. And then someone else, you know, someone talked about this also during the gender role analysis, that toxic masculinity can set someone up for shallow relationships with friends, family, and romantic partners. When I did the gender role analysis in the jail, they're super thoughtful and insightful. And one of the things someone said is, I can't tell my dad I love him. You know, that was how he was impacted, you know, or how he thought of what it meant to be not manly. Someone else said, it's not manly to catch feelings, right? So you're constantly holding people at an arm's length, you know, family, friends, romantic partners. Growing up, I know too, you know, as far as homophobia goes, you know, I'd see guy friends, you know, either hug or say something, ooh, that maybe was a little too emotional, and they'd immediately say, no homo, right? Because heaven forbid you express, you know, genuine emotion and affection for someone else. So toxic masculinity and sexuality and sexual abuse. In a similar way, males are usually the perpetrator of sexual assault. Toxic masculinity also plays a role in the greater risk of violence for the LGBTQIA+ community. That we know that, okay, yes, women are at greater risk of sexual violence than men, but when you start to add levels of marginalization to that, so, you know, the more marginalized you are, the more marginalized identities you occupy, such as, let's say, a Black queer woman, your risk of violence increases. And we can tie that back to sort of this box mindset. You don't fit into my idea of what gender should look like. You're too manly. You're not manly enough. The root of hate is fear and, control. And so that sort of sets us up for that increased risk of violence, if that makes sense. Again, the flip side, 1 in 6 men have experienced sexual abuse or assault in their lifetimes. But, as we talked about earlier with mental health in general, that number is probably a lot higher, right? That we as a society don't view men as victims, and certainly men tend to not view themselves as victims. So toxic masculinity increases both risk of perpetration, so, okay, like at parties, this egging on or to be cool, hey, go do this to this person, prove yourself. So it increases both the risk of perpetration and victimization. That, for young boys, they may be more likely to be targeted for the simple fact, not having anything to do with the sexuality of the perpetrator, but for the simple fact that boys are less likely to report, because typically we don't have these conversations with our boys as much as we do with our girls. And that also, recovering from sexual violence for anyone is incredibly difficult, but there are some differences for male survivors, right? So if we, again, take it back to that gender role analysis, God, how difficult must it be to recover from sexual violence if you're not allowed to feel weak or scared, you're not allowed to cry. That must be really difficult. And just anecdotally, what I have seen is there tends to be a lot more repression for adult male survivors of childhood sexual abuse, that they might stuff that down way deep and it might not come back up until their middle age. Okay. So what is healthy masculinity? So we've kind of talked about some of this really not so great stuff, right? Toxic masculinity, toxic for a reason. So let's talk about what it means to be healthy masculinity. It's nuanced. It's not any one thing, right? So whereas toxic masculinity is very rigid, healthy masculinity is very flexible. It looks like freedom to be yourself truly and openly, a respect for individuality, right? So let's say I, as a man, can, watch football every Sunday, but also be really into show tunes. And we can do, this idea of holding both. Or I can, if I were a man and I could, really take good care of my skin and my hair and my appearance, but maybe really into craft beer. Just some examples, right? And by, being strong, and being strong by admitting when you're feeling weak and asking for help. Okay. And taking this spectrum approach, again, that it's not just this very narrow picture of what it means to be a man, but, that it can vary and that it can certainly change throughout life, really. And so in kind of describing all of that, we're really talking about healthy masculinity or healthy humanity. We talk about healthy toxic masculinity, but there's some toxic femininity going on too, right? And I think these ideas of healthy masculinity can certainly be applied when we think about females or women or girls, right? It's okay to be both. Okay. So having some idea of what that means, it's a little nebulous, but how do we promote this at all ages, with all people, and within yourself? Okay. So, and then working outside the gender binary. So we think about, teachers or parents, You know, when we think about toys and colors and chores and hobbies and jobs, that, okay, let a boy play with a baby doll. I saw something recently on the internet that said, you want to complain about your man or your husband, not helping you in the kitchen or at home, but you're snatching the baby doll out of your son's hands. What message are you sending there? So yeah, let them play with, both the trucks and the kitchenette. A color is a color. Let someone gravitate to whatever colors they want to, wear or use. Same chores for everybody. Allowing them to pick out their own hobbies or, gravitate towards their own vocation or job. Emotionally. So I didn't say this earlier, but I've heard the metaphor used that, so for women, we are typically given the 64 count of Crayola crayons, in terms of our emotions. We're thought of as being more emotional, more expressive. And I think to some degree that's true, but how much of that is socialization? And oftentimes boys are only given the 8 count box. And maybe even with that, all the crayons are red, right? You're allowed to be emotional, but you can only feel anger. So give them the big box. And, for any child, allow them to express their emotions. Let girls be angry. Give them the big box, allow them to be emotional. We tend to invalidate children's emotions without maybe even thinking about it. So for example, a kid is crying, maybe they hurt themselves, and our gut reaction is to say, oh no, don't cry, it's okay. No, maybe, this is the greatest pain this child has ever felt, or, they're really scared. Let's not immediately shut down that emotion, but, just kind of acknowledge it and validate it and say, oh, I see you're upset. I see you're scared. What can I do to help? Okay, let me do that. Oh, it's all right, So being mindful of how we're invalidating or validating emotions for kids. Root out misogyny, promote equality. So yeah, very closely linked, this toxic masculinity and misogyny. Something, and again, doing it within yourself. So for example, I have 2 older brothers, and I am probably the most athletic one, or at the very least stuck with sports the longest. And growing up, my dad used to joke and say, oh yeah, she's my best son, right? And I thought that was great. I was just like, ha ha ha, yeah, that's really cool. I don't really know how it made my brothers feel. To be honest, I think they're probably okay, but I don't know. But also me recognizing now, I was really happy, to be seen as, more masculine maybe, or wow, I thought that was a really cool thing. And so kind of checking your own internalized misogyny. Again, this is for everyone. And then ultimately by example. So like I said earlier, the way we learn from our primary caregivers and from those around us by far is by example, by seeing and hearing what others do. And so the best thing you can do is lead by example. So especially if you're a man, feel your emotions, hug people, genuinely engage, don't be afraid to say you love your friend, no matter what their sex or gender is. And like I said, with women as moms, teachers, friends, promoting this, not shaming anybody for, feeling a certain emotion or liking a certain hobby, that this is something that we all can participate in. And, as the title of the presentation suggests, right? Boys will be men. The things that they learn and see as children are eventually going to manifest as adults. And what is it that we're hoping to see? What are we trying to create? And understanding that it affects all of us. Okay. So I think we have just a few minutes for questions. I'll go ahead and stop sharing the screen.
So if anyone has questions, you could put them in the chat and I can read them and Liz can answer.
You can also privately send them to Liz if you would like, you know, if you want to keep it, you know, between you and Liz answers it, you know.
And I know y'all got a lot on your mind because Liz, you said so many things that had me like triggered, because I remember when I was in middle school and I had the coach in my middle school would tell my 8th grade boyfriend not to be with me because there's so many other pretty girls, and I would be like, that's predatory behavior, number one. And number two, it also had to do with like him being a tad racist, but yeah. So let's read these questions. So Debbie asked, where can we see more of your work, groups, etc.?
Yeah, so I guess the best place to check it out would be our website, my agency's website, safeharborshelter.com. Or I think they listed my email as well if you want to reach out. So that's just liz@safeharborshelter.com. And yeah, and another disclaimer is I could talk about this, you know, for hours, days, weeks. So we only have a limited time. And like I said, this is really nuanced stuff. It's really complicated. So yeah, I did just throw a whole lot out to you. And you know, I encourage you all to continue to look into this, to explore this topic.
I really like the point. Oops, sorry. I really like the point you brought up when it comes to men crying. Sorry, y'all. I'm refilling my water thing. I'm gonna stop now. Oh wait, before I talk, someone asked, do you have any ideas or resources for parents of young boys to facilitate healthy masculinity or healthy humanity, as you said?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Actually, so someone local to the Richmond community, he has this movement sort of called, so it's Men to Heal, it's mental health, but Men to Heal. And you know, I like to check things out before I suggest them to clients. And there's this book called Man, Just Express Yourself. And it says interactive planner guide for men, young and old. And it's really just a bunch of journal prompts. But and I looked through it and it's pretty cool. So that's one thing that immediately, I mean, just because I have it behind me on my desk, that's something that pops into my head. I think, again, by leading by example, so not necessarily even just for masculinity, but when I see adult clients, like, hey, yeah, you're demonstrating right now, you know, by coming to therapy, that it's okay to ask for help. So keeping those things in mind, you know, what are you demonstrating? I'm sorry, I don't have better answers right off the top of my head for that one. I will try to think of that.
I feel like this conversation within itself is the resource. Like, I really resonated when you were talking about how even as women, we could assimilate to that toxic masculinity with our rhetoric and stuff like that. And it kind of reminds me of this thing that's becoming more trendy now, like all AAVE, which is basically like how like Black people come up with the lingo and stuff like that we like all say, like slang and stuff like that.
American vernacular. I got you.
I'm so sorry. I live next to a highway, so I'm sorry if everybody heard that. But yes, Zaya, can you say it again so everybody knows the legit?
Yes. So, Liza said AB, but I gotta, help y'all know the full acronym for it. So it's African American Vernacular, also known as Ebonics.
Yes.
Well, back to you, Liza.
So a term that's being more trendy now is called like pick-me's. And basically that it goes in line with what you're talking about, of like how a woman could assimilate to that rhetoric of like, well, if like I need to be the type of woman that like takes care of my man, and if you're not doing that, then there's something wrong with you, rather than it being like, if you want to take care of your man, that's your business and that's your choice and that's fine. But it doesn't need to be a thing that if somebody else isn't doing that, that makes them a bad person or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also got a question, I think, through direct message. How do you think girlfriends of boys can encourage their friends to talk about their emotions, feelings, without pushing them to express themselves? That's a hard one to not push someone. So just genuinely asking, like, hey, how are you? Whatever, asking those questions, but then, right, respecting their boundaries, because then that continues to communicate like, hey, it's safe to open up. Because if you're going to push, that's not, oh, then this isn't safe and I can't necessarily share. And again, even with what Liza just said, making sure you're affirming emotional expression or healthy masculinity, even when it's less obvious, right? So sort of that positive reinforcement. So when it does happen, acknowledge that, encourage that, and stay away from shutting those things down, or engaging in even if it feels harmless, those colloquial name calling and those kinds of things. I hope that answers that a little bit.
Well, this was amazing. I want to thank you so much, Liz, for this incredible presentation. And we want to invite everybody to continue to make sure you stay in touch with Liz. This will be up. And Liz, where can we find you on social media?
So I don't have a public social media myself, but you can follow, so it's Safe Harbor RVA on Instagram.
Great, great, great. We really appreciate you being here with us. And everybody, we're going to get started in about 7 minutes with our next presentation. I know this has been an amazing day, and we really appreciate everybody here. Be sure to follow Safe Bay on social media, which is at safe_bay. And we also want to give a shout out to Community X, who is our tech partner. They are building the social network for social good. It is a social networking app that launches next month, and it connects change makers like you and me and everybody else on this call around cause areas they really care about. In partnership with them, we're asking you to go to their website at www.communityx.tech. And we want you to join the wait list and vote for those cause areas that you want to see, like inclusive sex ed, like mental health awareness, like LGBTQ inclusion, and centering sex positive messaging for the disabled. So we want you to go and vote, and be sure in the referral code to say Safe Bay. And we have about a 6-minute break, and we will be right back, right back. I see there are some questions in the chat. I'm going to let the host kind of take the questions in the chat, and we're going to be right back in about 6 minutes. So stay tuned.